So Cliff, when did you first become interested in aviation?
I think very early days, Mike. I was a farmer's boy, so we lived in Kent, and a lot of activity in those days where aeroplanes, stations that were still operational were Manston and Westmoreling, Biggin Hill, and the aeroplanes that used to come back in from their gun firing used to come right over the farm. And it was a great adventure for us if one of the sleeves that they were towing for their air-to-air firing detached and came down on the farm. Anyway, so I had an interesting aviation from a very early stage, ATC and things of that sort, and my first flight in a Chipmunk, etc., etc. So that was really my introduction to aviation. I always wanted to fly. I think it's best put. I didn't exactly excel in my secondary education, not so much from an academic point of view, but I left school prematurely, I think is the way they put it. More bluntly, I think the headmaster said it's you or me, and it's not going to be me. So I came into the Air Force at the age of 16 as an apprentice because too young to fly. But I was very lucky that I was selected for pilot training while I was an apprentice. And at 2.5 years later, I was told by the commandant at Halton, our apprentice school. And the commandant was an Air Commodore, very famous wartime Spitfire pilot called Al Deer, and he was our commandant. Al Deer was by that time an Air Commodore, and he basically said, I think it was a joke, I hope it was, he said, I think you're going to be a bloody awful engineer, so we're sending you pilot training. So I found myself at Cranwell starting my pilot training in 1966, having joined in 1963.
So could you tell us some of the aircraft you started basic training on and what they were like to fly?
Well, my first basic training was on the Jet Provost. It was an interesting time in the Royal Air Force at the time because a lot of the when you first came in, you normally did Chipmunk flying first and then went on to Jet Provost. But there was a feeling, I think, by the Royal Air Force that we're becoming a much more of a jet air force. And in consequence, they thought we'd take us right through jet training. So we were one of the first entries that came in exclusively on the jet. I'll come back to that later because, anyway, I went through on the Jet Provost 3 and 4, and we did about 170 hours on the Jet Provost at Cranwell, including all the basic flying training, formation, instrument flying. And we got our wings in August 1968, just 50 years ago. Seems like yesterday. And that the aeroplane was a delight to fly, the Jet Provost. Some people said it was perhaps a little bit too straightforward for basic training. I immediately I'd finished and got my wings, went up to Royal Air Force Euston sorry, Spitfires and Hurricanes taking off in the background. Immediately after I'd finished, I went as a gap in my flying training, and I went with Northumbrian University Air Squadron and checked out on the Chipmunk, which was probably one of the best things I ever did because it gave me tail dragging prop experience, and I was able to come back to that at various gaps when I was on an enforced time behind a desk or something. Yeah. But that was only for about a month before I went to RAF Valley on the Nat to do my advanced flying training.
And what was the Nat like to fly?
Super. Bit intimidating. It looks small, but it's power weight. It was very swift. It was not an aeroplane you mucked around with, if you understand me, we did, but not not close to the ground or the rest of it. So it was quite a challenge coming from the Jet Provost to the Nat. High approach speed, lots of things about it you really had to watch out for.
So after the Hunter, you got posted to your first frontlines jet. Can you tell us about this and what your first thoughts of the Lightning were?
When you went from the Hunter, which was in itself a good high-performance aeroplane, I always remember when I arrived at Coltishall, which is where we did our Lightning conversion, and walking across the hangar for the first time and looking, and I thought, my goodness, that's a big beast. Just to look at the Lightning, it looked mean, and it looked full of performance, and of course that's the way it proved to be. And so at Coltishall we did about I think it was about 60 hours on the aeroplane, maybe not as much, but 50 or 60 hours anyway. And the whole point was that you went through obviously your normal conversion to get your instrument rating, and then you were into your applied intercept training. Really high workload aeroplane actually, because being a single seater, and you had to do the obviously control the radar, the missiles, and everything else that went with it. So the aeroplane itself was a delight to fly, absolute delight to fly, and I'll go back to that. But where people fell down on conversions, if they were scrubbed, was normally because they couldn't operate the aeroplane.
Right, yeah.
Now, my first flight, your very first flight in the Lightning, was what we called an instructor's benefit. You just sat in the aeroplane with an instructor and got airborne, and it was a good day for him because he could just show us what it was all about. And I think, I didn't know whether it was to impress us or intimidate us, but I always remember my instructor was a chap called Flight Lieutenant Jimmy Jewell, who subsequently was a very well known here at Duxford, flying the B-17.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, Jim, we got airborne, and it was a reheat takeoff in a Mark V, and it truly was gut-wrenching, awe-inspiring, and it was as if somebody had got hold of the world and towed it away from you. That's the way. And as we were going up at an incredible angle of climb and speed, he looked across at me as we were sort of almost lying on our backs going airborne, and rather laconically he said, "There you are, young man," he said. "The only reason we've got wings on this airplane is to keep the nav lights apart."
What a brilliant quote.
So we went through the training there. I mean, the thing about the Lightning was it was always it never had a great deal of fuel.
No.
Compared, you had two massive engines, and you really had to be on your mettle to get in all that you needed in that sortie, and you're always looking at the fuel gauges.
Yeah.
It's seriously, I mean, if a combat sortie in the shorter range airplanes could be 15-20 minutes or something like that, but we generally eked about half an hour out of them. Later on, I went on to the longer range, but anyway, I finished at Coltishall. I was posted to Treble 1 Squadron at RAF Wattisham, it was just the best thing for a young man in this wonderful aeroplane, a good captain, a good aeroplane to earn your spurs on, I think is the best way. You really had to be on your mettle, but it was so wonderful to fly. Beautifully handling machine. A lot of people used to say, "Oh, yes, and landing was a controlled crash." Nothing could be further from the truth. You could really finesse the Lightning on to the ground. In a crosswind, you could wear out not because of ineptness on the behalf of the pilot, I quickly add, but in a crosswind, the tires were such high pressure things, you could get rid of a pair of tires in one landing.
Wow.
In a crosswind. But normally they didn't last that long. Mm-hmm. We obviously had a brake parachute, because for obvious reason, you're coming around finals at about 170, coming across the hedge at around about 150 knots. So you're fair moving,
Well, yeah.
that's for sure. But the airplane was eminently flyable, and as I say, very demanding, particularly at low level. And very sadly, we did, the lightning force did in what was a highly demanding environment. Anyway, that was my first tour, and I got selected from there to go back to Coltishall to become a weapons instructor. That was another high intensity program up at Coltishall, where you not only did it, but you taught other people how to do it, which is always a good lesson for anybody becoming an instructor.
Yeah.
And I finished that. I had a little bit of a tragedy in my life at that time. I lost my first wife.
Oh,
but the Royal Air Force were great. Although I had been retoured on Treble One, they decided to send me to Cyprus to 56 Squadron,
oh, yes.
and which I thought was magnificent as human relations, and the Royal Air Force were very good at that time, and they sent me to Cyprus as one of the weapons instructors on 56 Squadron, which were flying the Mark 6, increased fuel, big ventral tank compared to the Mark 3, which I'd been flying on Treble One Squadron. And not only did it have the same missiles, but it also had two 30mm cannons.
Yeah.
Actually, in the ventral fuel tank, I think only the Brits can put two guns in a fuel tank, but
Sounds about right.
it worked okay.
Yeah.
And I had 18 wonderful months in Cyprus, and during that period, of course, we had the Turkish invasion.
Yes, yeah.
During the time in Cyprus, the Turkish invasion of Cyprus, which was prompted by actually Greeks fighting Greeks, Makarios's men being and the National Guard. Anyway, they had a bit of a punch-up, and then eventually the Turkish government, somewhat understandably, said we won't have a Greek-dominated island, because it had been obviously dual nationality, and they invaded. And it was very interesting that I was scrambled one day. We knew this was all going on, the fight had been going on, but the Turks hadn't invaded. But we anticipated that they may, probably would. And I was brought to, I was on what we called battle flight, QRA, and I was brought to readiness, and as I clambered in, the controller said, we've got 6 tracks coming down from Adana, and gave me a scramble. So I was rather pleased to see my flight commander also strapping to an airplane, because 6 to 1 didn't seem like a very good odds at the time. As it turned out, we scrambled and intercepted RF-84Fs aircraft, the Turkish reconnaissance airplanes, and we escorted them. And it was, our rules of engagement, obviously we had to be shot at before we shot back, and of course they seemed to be as nervous as we were. And of course the Lightning, it's quite a big airplane compared to an RF-84, and so we were, I was in close formation escorting this Turkish pilot who I met many years later, but that's another story. And we escorted them around, and it was very easy to know the areas that they were reconnoitering, because you could see the camera doors on the nose of the RF-84 coming open. Anyway, we did that, and that was all very exciting time. And then of course they did invade. We were rather restricted to defending the sovereign base areas, and by that time we'd been reinforced by Phantoms as well, in case we really did get into a hot engagement. As it turned out, it didn't, but we had a lot of very exciting flying. That's for sure. Cyprus itself was a great environment to fly in, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
And a great environment to be in. But sadly, to our amazement, given all that had happened in 1974, at the end of 74, the government of the day decided they were going to withdraw.
Very strange that.
Yes, yeah, and of course, luckily they didn't close Akrotiri for all the reasons today. It's used so much in that rather hot part of the world. I mean hot in political terms rather than... we came back with the aeroplanes again to Wattisham, dear old Wattisham, and I was with the squadron then again all the way through 1975 into 1976.
Some good times on the Lightning then.
Fabulous. I mean, I got about 1,300 hours on the aeroplane, and it was just a wonderful period in my life. I think it was, as I've already said, a great aeroplane for developing not only your flying skills but your captaincy skills, because you really did need to be on top of the job. You know, never had an excess of fuel, that's for sure.
So before we move on, I have to ask, how the Lightning fare in DACT with the types at the time?
Very well, very well. It had a lovely wing, and we're talking about a time when a lot of the European air forces had the 104.
Yeah.
So no contest really. We outclimbed and outturned the 104. Good aeroplane that it is, and I've flown in the 104. But the Lightning was in it, and of course we used to. We were cleared to air test the Lightning to 56,000 feet, and that the reason it got only at 56,000 feet was a limitation on the oxygen system and your pressurization.
So nothing to do with the aircraft itself?
No, the aircraft, and indeed, and others I'm sure went further and higher than I did, but you used to do an accelerated run through 1.3 and then did a constant Mach climb. But by the time, if you handled the engine, and you had to handle the engines properly, you had to gradually reduce the reheats till you got, as you were getting higher, so you didn't get what we call a rich cut.
Right.
So the last thing you want is the engine blowing out at that height and losing pressurization, because you can get some fundamental physiological problems then. But we all went through that, and I mean, I only went into the mid-60s, but I know a lot of my friends who went even further, and it was amazing. I mean, on the few occasions I did on the air test, you can actually see the curvature of the Earth. The sky goes a very deep midnight blue. All the light is actually reflected from below, and as you went up, the amazing thing was that you were doing a very high Mach number still, but because we had what we called a strip speed in the aeroplane, you could see, compared the airspeed to the Mach number, and the airspeed was incredibly low, sort of speed you only see in the circuit or just above, but the Mach, you were still doing 1.3.
Yeah.
And it gives you an indication of the relative relationship between airspeed and Mach number.
Of course, yeah.
And we used to roll, and you didn't have enough tail to push. You tended to roll and pull the aeroplane down, hoping that the engines weren't going to go out. But my flight commander, who had actually flown U-2s, really got us all together one day and said, "Look, you boys are playing with fire there, because if the engines go out, you could have a real problem with your pressurization." And
wow.
And so, but anyway, we did. We went to great heights, and indeed it was the Lightning. It only became known latterly when the black programs were coming out. The Lightnings did interceptions against U-2s, really to prove or disprove whether other airplanes could get to the same sort of height.
Yeah.
And of course the Lightning did, which was a bit of a sobering thought for the U-2s, because Soviets were getting airplanes of quickly a MiG-21, which were comparable performance. So, but we did actually do interceptions, not me personally, but and indeed it was unknown to me when I was in the Lightning Force. But latterly it became known that we'd done interceptions just to prove or disprove, and it proved that the Lightning could get to those. We were pretty much ballistic as we went past. I wouldn't say that you could fly like the U-2. Anyway, that was the end of my 76. Brought an end to my my flying in the Lightning after about 1,300 hours.
Mm-hmm. And then you were lucky enough to go on to fly the FG1 and the FGR2. How did you feel about this?
Well, I was very pleased. I was I was given a tour with the Army at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, where I managed to play hooky on certain days and go and fly the Chipmunk to keep my. And in fact, I ran the flying club for the academy as well. But obviously, I was itching very quickly to get back to jet flying. I'd been promoted to squadron leader, so when I was told I was going, as it happened, back to Treble 1 Squadron, by now re-equipped with the FG1 and the FGR2. They had a mix of the old Navy airplanes, and so I did refresher training on first the Jet Provost and again the Hunter. Jet Provost at Leeming and the Hunter at RAF Brawdy. Great fun going back through the training, and found myself at Coningsby on the Phantom. First impressions were not as positive as I would have wished. Phantom with the Spey is a very powerful aeroplane, but the increment you got with reheats was enormous. In cold power, it had less thrust than the Lightning. In reheats, it had a lot more. But so in cold power, it was a bit pedestrian, particularly at height. Great low-level aeroplane because it's a fan engine. So I always remember my first takeoff and adopting from my memory banks an angle of climb which I thought was going to be appropriate, and it was far too high, and I had to shallow it off just to keep the speed. But I got to love the Phantom. It didn't have the handling characteristics of the Lightning. The Lightning was just a thoroughbred in its handling. Difficult is the wrong word, but it didn't have quite the characteristics that the Lightning did. As you could see, tips of the wings turning up, tail turning down. In fact, I think sometimes they called it double ugly, but it was nonetheless an incredibly good warplane, much better in somewhat is a warplane than a Lightning, in that it had 8 missiles, a gun, a lot of fuel, a pulse Doppler radar. We only had a pulse radar and a navigator. Although I'd been in single-seaters, and we always rude about two-seaters, actually it was the way to go. Having another pair of eyes in that aeroplane and controlling the radar, a worked-up 2-seat crew on the Phantom, and it was a quantum leap in our operational capability. And I got to love it. I flew with Treble 1, and we were intercepting the Bear and doing a lot of QRA missions, which were fun in themselves. You always knew when you were intercepting a Bear with a political officer on board, because they were all very grumpy. But if they didn't have a political, they would show you copies of Playboy and Coca-Cola. And it was a serious business, because some of them would try and drag you down at low level, particularly at night, and then throw a turn into you, and if you weren't careful. So it was a serious business. I wouldn't, but great fun. And of course we had detachments all over Europe, and that was my time on Treble 1, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I was sort of associated with the Phantom for about 10 years. Later, I then went on a ground tour, but I just stayed in touch. In Germany, I was the Wing Commander Air Defence in Germany, but I just stayed in touch with the Phantom. Kept my simulators up to speed, and so at the end of my ground tour in Germany, I think I was a pain in the bum to my posting officer, because I was phoning up all the time about where am I, and of course, being a wing commander by now, I was really bucking for a squadron. About 3 years into my ground tour, I got phoned up and told I was going to become a squadron commander and command 74 Squadron, which was then flying the F4J back at RAF Watersham again. But I know I spent a lot of my career there. But the F4J was was an airplane that we'd bought from literally out of the desert. They'd been stockpiled by the United States Navy. We'd had the Falkland in the meantime. We'd deployed a squadron down there, so we needed to bolster our home defence. So we literally bought these. They were refurbished. They were effectively S model Phantoms, but still had what we call the hard wing. It didn't have the automatic slats, although it had slats for landing, and it had a jet engine rather than the turbofan, which is Spey. So, interestingly, it retained all the area ruling, which the F4K and the MRs had lost.
Yeah.
So it was back, and it was as a Phantom goes, it was a really sporty airplane.
Yeah.
And it had a very good performance at high level all the way through. Had engines both in cold power and reheat, similar to the Lightning. Less installed thrust than the Spey with a reheat in, but when we were in cold power we had more. And we had instant reheat.
Yes, of course.
Whereas the K and the M, the Spey, you had to wait a half.
5 seconds.
It never actually passed Boscombe Downs acceptance for that, but we had it in the Air Force anyway. So I was a squadron commander of the 74, the Tigers.
Yep.
Wonderful days. I had a very young squadron, which was good. Very hair raising when I went on detachment sometimes with the youngsters, but it was great fun. Absolutely fun. And I thought the Tiger's head as a badge and a motto, I fear no man, has got to be. And I'm very sad that it no longer is a frontline squadron.
Which it should be.
Well, absolutely. Yes. Let's start the movement. Bring back the Tiger
Let's get
squadron.
A petition going. So, can you tell us which you prefer to fly, the Spey model or the American version?
I actually ultimately preferred the American version. I thought that was, but bear in mind, to be fair to the K and the M, the original had to drag bombs and rockets and lots of things off a small carrier. So once you had the reheats in, of course, they were effective for a small carrier. Probably couldn't have done that. In fact, I know you couldn't have done it with the pure jet, what we call it the American version of. But on a fixed runway, and given the job that we had to do in air defence, I found the F4J a much more capable.
I'm surprised about that actually, because
throughout I'm convinced we had a good radar. It was fast. It had a good high level performance. All in all, it was an excellent airplane. As I say, that's not to damn the F4K and the F4M at low level, excellent.
Very careful.
But you need a performance across the spectrum.
Yeah, of course. And I also like the colours of the J models. They were always great. The Tuck Edge blues, yes, that was brilliant.
And we had one bit of fun, which still exists. Two of us, my boys, convinced me that a Jaguar shouldn't hold the speed record from London to Edinburgh, which has been held by various airplanes. And a Jaguar was the holder, and it held it from, I can't remember what the date it did it, but it did it overland with a very high tailwind, because you're not allowed to go supersonic overland. You have to be 10 miles off the coast if you're going parallel to it, or 30 miles if you're pointing towards it. So the boys said, let's see if we can break it, and we took two F4Js clean, and nice noise in the background.
Beautiful.
And we took 2 aeroplanes purely if one was unserviceable, we could still. And it was all done with the FIA, and they had all their super clocks. And we did it such that we came up over Norfolk to Blakeney, and then up around the coast, and accelerated once we crossed the coast. We were very high subsonic, and then we were averaged about 1.6 Mach all the way up the coast, and crossed the extended line, which is what you did, and then diverted very quickly into Lucas because it was short of fuel, and we broke the record, not by a lot, but it's 27 minutes and 3 seconds.
Wow.
From London to Edinburgh, and it still stands. I'm sure now I've said that there's going to be everybody going to break it.
Yeah, of course, brilliant.
Anyway, being boss of the Tigers and 74 Squadron was obviously a very real high point, and the F4J and all that went with it was just a high point of my career. One of many high points. I'm privileged to have been able to fly so many good airplanes. But from there, I went to the Falkland Islands as the station commander, still retaining my currency on the F4. I was also lucky as well to fly the C-130 and the Sea King while I was down there. And it was a wonderful year being able to fly the F4 in that sort of environment, which a bit like today, normally quite clear, but very windy, and then you had 4 seasons in a day, so you had to watch the weather quite closely. So that was a wonderful period as well. I came back after a year, and I'd been assigned to be the station commander following that at RAF Coningsby. You're lucky to get a station in the Royal Air Force, but I was doubly lucky. Not only was it a fighter station, but it's also the one that had the Battle of Britain Memorial flight on it.
What a privilege.
And like all station commanders, you're allowed to fly the airplanes that are on your station. So, well, before I got to that though, I converted to the Tornado, but and went to operational status as well. And about that time I was told I was already Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, and so I'd been told that I was going to Dhahran as the detachment commander, which I duly did towards the end of 90, and then obviously we were into the first Gulf War. It was 3 months. It seemed a lot longer at the time, purely because of what we were doing, and I was very privileged to command a composite wing of bombers, recce and air defence Tornado aeroplanes.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's, as they say, is history now, but I did manage to fly one a few sorties down there. As I say, that seemed like quite a long time, but in fact I was back by April, straight into command of the station. Wow. of RAF Coningsby, which had 3 squadrons, 2 operational squadrons and 1 training squadron, which were 5, 29 and 56 squadrons, 65 going to 56, and I flew with all those squadrons variously. But as important, I suppose, for the future, I was able to fly with the Battle of Britain Memorial flight, and it was in that time in 1991 that I first off the Hurricane. BBMF, you tended to do 15 hours on the Hurricane and then went on to the Spitfire.
Okay.
And so I did 15 hours on the Hurricane. Wonderful. I must admit, when I was taxiing out the first time in the Hurricane, I'd had a wonderful briefing from Squadron Leader Day, who was the OC BBMF. But one thing I hadn't realised, being a jet pilot at that time, I'd flown Chipmunks and Harvards, but the noise was really you hear everything, the reduction gear, and that lovely Merlin growl that you hear outside is one thing, but when you're in the cockpit, it's a different. You hear everything. Sounds like a bag of bolts sometimes. And I must admit, I thought this can't be right. I was waiting for someone to stop me, but no one did, so I assumed all was well. Anyway, that was my first Hurricane flight. I did 15 hours, and then I was converted to the Spitfire. My first ride in a Spitfire, wonderful, was the Mark II, a very famous Battle of Britain aeroplane, and to trust me on my first solo I thought was amazing. But anyway, I got it back on the ground. You have to say that when you're flying such precious, iconic aeroplanes, and ones that belong to the British public ultimately, there's a huge responsibility.
I can imagine.
So I had two wonderful years flying with BBMF, the Hurricanes, Mark V, and then the Mark 19. With a sound like that in the background. So as I was saying, that I flew all of the three marks of Spitfire that we had on BBMF and the Hurricanes. During that time on BBMF, I had occasion to do a display at Mildenhall.
Oh wow!
With two Mark 19 Spitfires, and after landing off one of this sortie, I walked over to another group of pilots, actually two pilots, one of whom was Ray Hanna. I knew Ray from Air Force days, and he ran here at Duxford, the old flying machine company, and he was with one of the other pilots. And I just sat down and we were just watching the rest of the air display, and Ray just said in his way, he said, "Would you like to come and fly with the old flying machine company when you finish with BBMF?" I told him that I was staying in the Royal Air Force, which I did, but he said, "Well, if you want to fly in your spare time, you can please do come and fly with us." So I took up that opportunity. My poor wife, who I'd told I was just going to do 2 years, I said I'd do 2 years of BBMF, and 27 years later, that's beginning to wear a bit thin, I think. But anyway, she does just about put up with it. But that was my introduction to flying here at Duxford. But just to continue on the RAF side, perhaps I can come back to the old airplanes, or the Warbird airplanes. Once I went from Coningsby, another wonderful 2 years. I was initially going to I went to what they call the Royal College of Defence Studies, but I was pulled out because there was somebody was unwell or left early, and the chain went that I was pulled out of the Staff College to go and be the Senior Air Staff Officer at Headquarters 11 Group at Bentley Priory. I retained my currency on the Tornado throughout that period, which was jolly nice. I know I didn't fly as much, but I still retained my currency. And then I was pulled over to 18 Group, which was over at Northwood, to be Chief of Staff of 18 Group, which is a maritime group. I didn't understand why at the time. Couldn't understand why you wanted a fighter pilot in a maritime group. But it became clear after about 6 months when I was told they were amalgamating both 11 and 18 groups, and I was going to be a group commander then as an Air Vice Marshal, and that was just wonderful, because I suddenly was commanding a group which had Tornadoes, Hawks, helicopters, and Nimrods, which I'd never flown. So during that period, aside from retaining currency on the Hawk and the Tornado, I did a course on the helicopter, although I was never a qualified helicopter pilot. They always had a responsible adult with me, make sure I didn't do anything wrong.
Of course.
But I did do that, and then I did a conversion onto the Nimrod, which is the largest aeroplane I'd ever flown in the RAF, and that was quite wonderful. For somebody of my background to suddenly have 13 crew, utterly professional bunch they were as well, and flying a large aeroplane close to the sea at 250 feet or 500 feet with considerable angles bank, hunting submarines, is a demanding job, and I actually think the Royal Air Force did a magnificent job with the Nimrod, and I loved it.
Yeah.
But so I I flew in the aeroplane, really quite a lot.
Yeah.
And that was another great 2.5 years where I could jump into a Hawk, fly to Kinloss, fly the Nimrod, or fly to Lucas and fly the Tornado.
I mean, that's
what a toy set. But in the meantime, in what spare time I had, I was flying quite regularly here at Duxford and with OFMC, and that opened a door to not just the Spitfire, but I was then flying Black 6, the Messerschmitt 109G, the Bouchon, Mustang, Corsair, and had started to come in the Sea Fury. I mean, it was a pilot's dream, and that's just carried on, I suppose. I've flown with TFC quite a lot in some of their airplanes, the Wildcat and Curtiss Hawk and things of that sort as well.
And you've also flown the F-86 Sabre, is that correct?
I flew the F-86. That was down at ARC when I started flying with ARC after OFMC, and we had a T-33 and the F-86A A model, owned by then Mr. Robert Horn. Unfortunately, we had a very sad accident here. Luckily, nobody hurt with the T-33, with the pilot and the engineer both got out of it. But I loved flying the T-33, lovely aeroplane. The F-86 was great as well. I've never flown the later Sabres. This was an early model Sabre, and really you were flying it mechanically, and the flying control surfaces were boosted by hydraulics.
Okay.
Later Sabres were all hydraulic controlled, and apparently actually were nicer to fly, the Ernie model. Certainly the Sabre was heavier that I flew, the A model was heavier than the Hunter, but nonetheless it was a wonderful privilege to fly.
Absolutely.
What was the oldest flying jet in the world, built and delivered in 1948. So it was, and we pulled the leg of the guys who made the Meteor and said, oh, it was the oldest flying jet. Well, actually, the Sabre we were flying was 9 months younger.
Oh, was it?
And I always remember the particular air show at Biggin Hill where we had to do a Korean War scenario, and it was the Firefly leading me in the Sabre, and the commentator was very well briefed, and as we went past, and he said, now ladies and gentlemen, which is the older airplane? And it was the Sabre, because the Firefly was 1949-50, that particular model.
Yeah, yes.
And so hey Mike, it's been a wonderful journey.
Yeah.
This year represents my 50th year with these, my wings.
They're the original wings.
They look it, don't they? They're looking pretty tatty. I don't know whether they're my original ones, but they're ones I've kept for some years, and they're beginning to look a bit threadbare, but you'll have to fight me to get them off me.
I can imagine.
And so it's been a great journey. I suppose there will come a time when I have to hang up my tired old flying gloves.
Hopefully many years to come, though.
Well,
if the wife says so.
Well, yes, if I get the necessary clearances from the MEMSAB.
Of course. So Cliff, do you have any hobbies apart from flying?
I do play I do play golf, but it's taking a little bit of a back seat because my wife, I normally play with her, and she's slightly had a bad back. But yes, I do golf. I ski in the winter, again with the family, with my crazy son who goes straight down the mountain, but I'm a little bit more, and my grandsons now, and my wife and my daughter all ski, so we ski in the winter. And I suppose, apart from keeping the house and garden, my wife and I are a member of a choral society. We're not allowed to laugh, but so I hold up not very well the tenor section of a particular. So I'm privileged to be president of the Battle Britain Memorial Flight Association and the Royal Observer Corps Association, and I'm also chairman of the trustees for the Bentley Priory Museum, which I do, if I can get a plug in, it's a great museum to visit down near Bushy Heath, Stanmore, and it's got all of Dowding's office, so I'm the chairman of those trustees, so I stay pretty busy.
You certainly do. And this could be a very tough question, but I have to ask it.
Yeah.
Have you had a favourite aircraft of every type you've flown? What is your favourite?
I'll put it this way, Mike, and it's a question that I'm very often asked, which is the favourite. Of course, before I'd flown the Warbirds, when I was flying the Lightning, wow, going to the reaches of space and going at that speed with an aeroplane which was so flyable was wonderful. Flying the F4, which amazing, for its day, amazing warplane. The Tornado was great as well. Or snarling along in a Sea Fury behind a 2,400 horsepower Centaurus, all wonderful. But if God gave me one more flight and said you can fly any airplane you like in the whole lot, and I suppose I'm up to 65 on types and marks, it'll have to be the Spitfire.
I thought it would be that, yes. It's such a classic, isn't it?
It is a classic aeroplane, and of course I have flown it for the last 27 years, I suppose, so I'm bound to get it into my blood. It's not an easy one, I have to say, but that would be it.
And is there an aircraft you wish you could have flown that you haven't?
Yeah, I'd love to have flown the Focke-Wulf 190 actually.
Oh, right, okay.
Having flown the 109, if I could have got into an original 190, people who've flown it say it's a cracking aeroplane. Amazing roll rate, great power unit, not without its vices, but I think in that sort of genre of aeroplane, I think I would have liked to have flown. I'd like to fly any airplane, but that one I suppose stands out as one I would quite like to have flown.
Yeah. Well, Cliff, thanks very much for being on the show.
Pleasure.